Hi, I'm Jamie.
And I'm Scott.
And welcome to the God or Not podcast, where truth springs from argument among friends. This is episode number 14, and coming up, Scott and I will be talking about the fine-tuning of the universe. Also in this episode, the God or Not book club, and spin the wheel. So grab your popcorn, sit back, and enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the center ring. This is the God or Not podcast. We're in for a great night of civil discourse here as these two warriors are revved up and ready to go. And now, let's get ready to dialogue!
Hello, Scott.
Hey, Jamie. How you doing?
Fine-tuning of the universe.
Yep, we're ready to roll.
This is going to be an interesting and fun podcast.
You can say that again.
It's going to be an interesting and fun podcast.
You can say that again.
No, we won't. So anyhow, the fine-tuning. This is one of my arguments for the existence of God. And it was one of the 5 that I had brought up in our initial discussion online.
Wait, there was 5? I remember 4.
Oh.
Is there a 5th one?
It was one of my 4 I brought up in our initial discussion on this.
You're trying to sneak another one in there on me?
Yeah, no. So anyhow, this is one of the main ones. And
right.
that you had some contentions, and so we're gonna jump in here and hit it. Do you have anything you want to say before we jump in?
Bring it.
Let's do it.
This is the main event.
So the fine-tuning argument. All right, Jamie, you ready to jump on this one?
Let's jump.
So the fine-tuning argument is an argument, ultimately an argument for the existence of a God, or depending on how it's framed. But it's a quote unquote scientific version of an argument from design, or another, a technical phrase that they use is the teleological argument. And that comes from the telos, meaning goal or objective. And so it's an argument based off of, what the ultimate purpose or what the ultimate goal or the ultimate objective of something is. And so in this case, we're a generic version of the argument. Basically, it's we notice some things about the universe. We notice, hey, this universe looks perfectly set up just for us. It's everything is just right. These different cosmological variables seem just perfectly set up so that suns can form, and so that planets can form, and so that life can develop, and so chemistry works the way it does, et cetera, et cetera. So we say all these things just seem just right, and so then and it seems unlikely that it just could have just randomly happened this way, and so something must have made it happen this way. That's kind of a generic version, but the argument we're gonna be talking about today is something is a little more specific, and this is the version that you've been using, and it's a commonly used version nowadays, I think. And so, correct me on any of these if I get them wrong. But the first premise is that the universe is fine-tuned to support life, and very often that premise can be implied too. I mean, it seems we're in this universe. Okay, premise 2 then. The fine-tuning must be the result of either necessity, chance, or design. Premise 3 is that it's unlikely due to necessity or chance. And so then the conclusion, which would follow from those premises, is that the fine-tuning of the universe is likely the result of the design. So what would you say about that as the general layout of your argument? That sounds pretty good.
Like you said initially, a lot of times they just automatically imply that the universe is fine-tuned. And I think we had talked about this before. It's worth repeating in a previous conversation. But when we talk about fine-tuned, we don't mean that there's some kind of tuner. We don't mean even though this might be an argument for design, that doesn't mean God. That's an extra argument, and that's another inference that we would have to make. It's just a very generic, scientific kind of statement. It's not a religious in any way. Of course, you can make some, implications, but again, that's a totally separate argument. So we're just talking about kind of generic understanding of fine tuning. We could say just right. Things are just right. Yep.
Right. And so, so when we use the term fine tuned, I think a lot of times if people hear fine tuned, I don't know about you, but I picture somebody like tuning a piano.
Yeah.
Right.
Spinning some dials.
So if we say fine tunes, it could mean that we're implying that it could be out of tune or that there's a tuner and that kind of thing. And so that's why I think it's important that we clarify that ahead of time. We're not saying that. We're just saying that, it's just right. Mm-hmm. And nothing, no implications beyond that, other than maybe what we could argue beyond, we'd have to make a separate argument for anything beyond that.
Right.
I also want to clarify that when we're talking about life, that's another thing. That's another term that's not necessarily clearly defined. And so whenever terms are not clearly defined, it really makes them like low hanging fruit for equivocation, for people to either intentionally or unintentionally misunderstand or misrepresent. And so in this case, we're talking about just us, basically, biological life, on Earth or life similar to life on Earth.
Right. It doesn't have to be necessarily human beings. So they say when they talk about life, it's the ability of any kind of organism to take in food for energy, grow, adapt to their environment, and reproduce. So it doesn't have to be like humans, but it does have to be,
well, it would be biological.
An organism, biological, carbon-based type of thing. It
would be based off of the chemistry that exists in our universe and so forth. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So that was premise one. We just wanted to clarify those two terms there. Otherwise, I don't think premise one is all that, controversial. Mm-hmm. But we can go on to premise two. And my first instinct or my first thought when seeing premise two is that it's not really a trichotomy. So we say that the fine tuning must be the result of necessity, chance, or design. Mm-hmm. But we haven't really eliminated other possibilities. And so you've mentioned this before in another context where you were saying that a dichotomy is not just this or that, it's this or not this, mm-hmm. right? And so in order for this to be a true, in this case, it's a trichotomy. We have three options here. If we say necessity, chance, or design, there's really, either known or unknown other options that we haven't eliminated yet. And so if we wanted it to be a true trichotomy, we would say something like it has to be a necessity, chance, or neither of those. Which could be, I think design would fall into that category.
Would it be would it be justifiable though to say at this point, since no one has thought of a fourth option, that it seems right that we could go ahead and go with what we have for now, and then if we discover other things, to reevaluate that.
Well, I mean, it would give us something to talk about if that's what you're asking. It wouldn't necessarily. I mean, it could, because if we want this, I mean, the goal of this is to prove
about anything,
the conclusion.
Though. We could say that about anything, though. That there might be some unknown thing out there that's somehow controlling that, and we could always keep pushing the can back or keep saying that there's something out there that is unknown.
Right. And so until we get to a point where we can eliminate those those other possibilities, then
we can't eliminate them if we don't know what they are. And since somebody could always say that, no matter how much we understand something, somebody could always say there's some.
True. You can argue a negative. Like, for example, I could argue that that there's no universe destroying chemicals floating around in the universe. And my argument would be that the universe hasn't been destroyed. And so, that
would be something we know about.
Right.
I mean, I just don't know that we can argue anything that if we don't know it, we don't know it.
Right. And so if we don't know it, I mean, that's like leaving the door open. We don't know. We can't shut that door. And so, if that's the case, then, we don't have a true trichotomy. And the reason that I bring this up is because that kind of invalidates the argument. That kind of, puts a spike in whether or not this is a valid argument. If we can't, because the argument is set up as an argument from, what's the word I'm looking for? It's we want to eliminate the possibilities. So the idea here is that we want to eliminate two of the possibilities, and so then it must be the third one, right? Well, the only way we can say that is if we know that there's not other possibilities. Like for example, a fourth possibility might be that there's a combination of maybe there's some random variation, but maybe some of the things were maybe like. So we're talking about these a handful of characteristics about the universe: the weight of a proton, the strength of gravity, the strength of the electromagnetic force, and different characteristics like that. If gravity was stronger, then it would affect chemistry a different way, or if different of the nuclear forces were different, then maybe an atomic nucleus wouldn't be able to hold together and that kind of stuff. Right. And so those are the things we're talking about. And so maybe some of them, there could be some randomness in some of them, but maybe some of the other ones are determined and maybe they depend on each other. So that would be another possibility. Or maybe that there's some unknown naturalistic process, like maybe our universe is part of a larger structure. We talked about that before. As well. And so maybe there's something from that larger universe that's directing our universe in a particular way. And that wouldn't really fall into any of those categories. It wouldn't be necessity. It wouldn't be chance or design. It would just be the result of a natural process.
But I think that just kicks the can back. I think my point is I don't want this to invalidate the argument just because there's something out there that we don't know about that it could all of a sudden show up. I think what we do in science is we go with what we know. We could draw conclusions from that. And science is always, we always leave the door open for science. So if someone comes up with another alternative and they want to put it on the table, then they can. And at that point, we can consider it. But I don't think that should stop us from forming some general conclusions about things based upon what we know. Because, but then we would always have that caveat there that this is, under the assumption that what we know is correct. Right. Yes, I'm fine with that. Yep.
Okay. Well, yeah, sure. Okay. But the fact that you don't want it to invalidate the argument doesn't mean that it doesn't invalidate the argument. If you want, and it's not about you. It's a weakness in this form of argument. If you want to make an argument by elimination, if you want to eliminate possibilities, you first have to establish that those are the possibilities.
Right, but does it seem fair to say, like, if you gave an argument for something, and I say, well, not a good argument because there could be something out there we're uncertain of.
Well, if my argument depended on being certain about that thing, then that would totally be fair.
But also, too, we have to keep in mind that this is, again, a probabilistic, like, what is more likely true than not. So we don't have to have 100% certainty. We don't have to have every single duck in a row. So
we're not talking about 100% certainty, but we are talking about reasonable certainty.
Right.
And so in order to have reasonable certainty, we have to at least have a reasonable justification for thinking that these are the only possibilities. But
okay.
We don't need to dwell on that. We can continue our discussion without having to, nail that point down. Unless you have anything else you want to say.
Progress. I call that progress right there.
Oh, okay. All right. So, another thing too is that design is really not clearly defined. How would you define design? How can you determine if something is designed?
I think, well, I guess that's a good question. In much of the literature, I guess that's just a given. I would say designed is something with, intentionality or purpose. I would say the basic understanding of design is something that is organized to form something with intentionality.
Okay. I mean, that seems reasonable.
Yeah. In a very generic sense.
Some sort. Yeah. Okay. So we would have to demonstrate some sort of intentionality. Okay. So that's premise 2. Premise 3. This is really the big one here. It's unlikely due to necessity or chance. And before we dive into the probabilities here, I just wanted to kind of do a quick rundown on what we're talking about. What is probability? And because I know that there's the big sticking point between you and I is how can we justify our conclusions about the probabilities. And so, how can we justify a probability? If I want to say something is 10% likely to happen, how can I come to that conclusion? How can I prop that up? And so there's basically 2 ways of justifying a probability. And the first one is called experimental probability. And that happens when you, let's say, for example, I wanted to determine, what's the probability that this coin will turn up a heads when I flip it. Okay. And so under the umbrella of experimental probability, what we would do is we'd just do it. We'd flip it a whole bunch of times and we would count. Okay. So maybe I'd flip it 100 times. I'd count how many of those were heads, and maybe, 43 of them were heads. And so I'd say, well, according to my experiment here, 43% chance of coming up heads, 43 out of 100. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to determining a probability that way. One, the advantage is that it doesn't require a deep understanding of what's going on. We're just observing, we're just watching something. And so it's very easy for really anybody to do, at least in this case, when we're talking about coin flipping. A child can count how many times we flip a head. So it's very easy and it doesn't require deep understanding. The drawback, though, of course, is that in any random process, and it depends on the process too, but there's going to be some variation. And so at least at first, our probabilities are going to be not very precise or not very accurate. And so and we call that the law of large numbers. And the law of large numbers says that the more you repeat an experiment, you have a tendency to get a more and more accurate answer. So in other words, if I flip the coin twice, and they both turn up heads, then that's 100% heads. But that doesn't seem very reasonable since I only flipped it twice. And so you might not believe me that the coin always comes up heads. But if I flipped it 10 times and it always came up heads, then maybe that would be more impressive. But my point is, though, is that the more times we do the experiment, then we get more and more accurate answers. So that's under experimental probability. And the other main type of probability is called theoretical probability. And this is when we base a probability on a model. Like when we're talking about the coin flip, maybe I know I can look at the coin and I can see that there's 2 sides, and within a certain a certain degree of margin of error, maybe that, I can show that the 2 sides are roughly the same, that the weight is evenly distributed. I know how I flip the coin. I know that I am physically incapable of tracking all the information that I would need as far as the flip is concerned. And so to me, at least, I have no way of predicting what it's going to turn up, and the system is chaotic enough that tiny little variations in the way that I flip it could have a big effect on how the coin lands. And so the advantage of that is that it can give you a much more accurate estimation of the probability. Of course, the drawback is that you have to have a deep understanding of the model. You have to know what's going on there. You have to understand the physics of what's happening. You have to understand the conditions that are there. And so there's trade-offs for both of those. And so that's experimental probability or theoretical probability. And there's actually, I kind of jokingly say that there's a third kind called rectal probability, and that's when you just pull the numbers right out of your ass, right? And so,
like 80% of statistics are made up.
80% of the statistics are made up on the spot, right?
That's right.
So let's under that in that context, let's look. I want to give an example of a die. So let's say I'm rolling a die, and I tell you that I just rolled a 1. Okay, and so I ask you, so what's the probability that I'll roll another 1? Okay. And so you might have assumptions about what you think about dice. Maybe you've probably used dice before. But I tell you that this die is not necessarily like any of the other dice that you've seen before. And so right from the get-go, it's going to be very difficult for you to come up with any kind of reasonable probability on, what are your chances of getting a 1. And so I need to give you information about the system. I need to tell you what's going on. Maybe I tell you that the die also has other numbers on it. Okay. And so, because we had no idea what might be if you take a die out of a game, maybe it has like different, maybe it has a 1 on one side, but it has like an apple on another side and a red dot on the other side, on another side, and has the word hate on another side or something like that. Just these obscure things. And so the only thing we really knew about the die from what I told you so far is that there's a 1. At least one of the sides has a 1 on it. Mm-hmm. And so, but then I can give you more information. And so then maybe I could tell you that, well, there's other numbers on the faces. Okay. And so that gives you a little bit more information. And so maybe you could, maybe you could come to a little bit of a better conclusion, but you still don't know what numbers are on there. You don't know if they're consecutive. You don't know what's the biggest number, what's the smallest number. We don't even know how many faces are on this die. And so these are all things that we need to know in order to form our basis. Mm-hmm. But even if we do know that, even if I told you there is 17 sides on this die, and even if I told you that it has the numbers 1 through 5 on there, but again, we still don't know what the probability of a 1 is, because obviously there's going to have to be multiple faces with different numbers. And we don't know if that's evenly distributed, or we don't know if there's a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4, and then 13 5s. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so depending on what that distribution of those numbers is, that's going to affect our probability. But even if I told you there are 6 sides on this die and they have the numbers 1 through 6 on them, we still can't come up with the probability because the faces might be different sizes and shapes. And so they might, the shape of the die itself will, of course, affect how it rolls. Maybe some of the edges are rounded. Maybe one of the faces is larger than the others. Maybe the weight has been shifted, loaded die, right? A lot of times that's why dice you see in Las Vegas are clear, is so that you can see that there's no weights in there. Mm-hmm. But, so maybe there's a weight on there that'll kind of make it roll one way or the other a little bit more often. So all this information we need to know before we can determine its probability. And so if we look at that and we think, okay, is this turn up a 1 because of necessity, chance, or design? That's going to be based off of what we know about mm-hmm. that die. And so if I want to make the argument that it's based off of necessity, then I'm going to have to show you, I'm going to have to justify that by showing you that all the faces were 1s, or maybe there were some faces that were not 1, but the die is set up in such a way that those faces could not end up on the top. Mm-hmm. And so, so if I wanted to make the case that it was based off of necessity, then I would have to make that case. If we wanted to show that it was designed, maybe I could show you where the weight was, inserted in there, or, I could show how, there would have to be some characteristic of the die that you shaved the edges mm-hmm. off of the other numbers or something like that. And then otherwise we could argue that it was by chance. We see that the sides are all the same. We know the physics of rolling. We know how the surfaces interact with each other, the felt on the table and the plastic that the die is made out of. And so, we could make an argument for chance in that way. And so the problem with the theoretical foundation is that we need to know a lot of information about how, not only what is available and how it works, but also, how those values interact with each other. And so if we expand that to then our talk about the fine tuning of the universe.
Yeah. So before we move on, I just had a question.
Okay. Yeah.
What do we need to know to postulate these universes? What would we need to know in order to say, okay, these are the way the universe could be? Uh-huh. What would we need to know?
Well, we would need to have some sort of evidence that it could turn out that way, either a mathematical model that predicts it. That would give us reason to think that it could turn up that way, or if we had some observation that something had turned up that way. we would have to have something that would support that belief. We would have to be able to. I think I heard Luke Barnes was an author of one of the resources that you gave me as a physicist. Actually, he's a postdoc researcher, but I didn't get a chance to read all of the stuff that you sent me. But one thing that he said that jumps out at me is what's important is the size of the bullseye compared to the size of the board. He was talking about if somebody throws a dart at a dartboard and hits the bullseye, you might not be all that impressed because maybe it's not as close to the center as it could have been, right? And so he said what's important is the size of the bullseye compared to the size of the board. So really what we need to know is we need to know the size of the bullseye and we need to know the size of the board so that we could compare, because of probability, we're comparing two numbers. We're comparing the thing we're looking for versus all of the possibilities.
So what would those be in this case? In the case of the universe.
So in this case, we'd have to have some boundaries on the physical parameters that we're talking about here.
Okay.
And largely we do. And, we know, we have these, and these are predicted by mathematical models. And so we can determine, what could happen. And in many cases, what could not happen. In some cases, those boundaries are a little fuzzy. But at least they're there enough that we can at least have a conversation about it. But what we would need to know, and here's what we don't know. The position that we're in here, as far as our knowledge of the physical universe, that represents the situation where we know all of the numbers on the die, or at least most of the numbers on the die, or many of the numbers on the die, but we don't know the size and orientation of the different faces. We don't know how many times one shows up on the die. We don't know the size of the one face. We don't know the shape of the edges and that kind of thing. And so it's not just a matter of knowing what could happen. We also need to know how those different values are, in relation to each other in order to come up with a probability.
So other than the physical, the boundaries on the different physical variables, what was that other thing? Do you think you're talking about the die, what would that be in relation to the universe that we're talking about, or the possible universes?
Well, it would be, if let's say we were able to restart the universe, 1 billion times. So we would need to know how many times out of that billion could this particular universe show up? And we don't know that. We don't know how common it is. We don't know if something has a bigger face than the other possibilities. Okay,
so if we were going to, all right, that makes sense. I understand that. So if we were going to say something is more likely than not, and we're dealing right now with necessity and chance and design, so we would have to ask ourselves, okay, is there something other than what we consider the laws of nature that's more fundamental that can make adjustments or pick? So could we say that these things are arbitrary or random unless we could find something that at least gives us some insight or some reason to believe that it's somehow one's being picked over another?
Well, we would need to have some sort of justification for saying that. We can't, like I said, even if we know the other possibilities, even if we could list all of the other possibilities, and in this case, we're talking about a continuum of possibilities. So obviously we can't list all of them because there'd be infinite, tiny little variations. But we would need to know, the weighting system. We would need to know, are any of the sides of the dice bigger than the other sides? And
right. So when
that's information that we just don't have.
So when you're rolling it over to the universe, because sometimes I have a hard time because I want I'm trying to find direct, a direct correlation, and because when we go back and forth from universe to die, for me something gets lost in the translation. And so I understand the boundaries on the physical variables. That makes sense. And I also understand that we have to determine if this is based on necessity, the universe had to be that way. We'd have to have some reason to believe that that it wasn't at random. And right now, all we have are the fundamental forces, which completely arbitrary, right?
Here's something that might help you. You've heard of a bell curve, right?
Yes.
So a bell curve, it's also called a normal distribution. It's a bell curve. It's high in the middle and low on the sides. That's called it's a probability distribution. And what a probability distribution is it's either graphically or sometimes you can list out all the possibilities. But basically, it's a list of all the possibilities along with their probabilities. So if we look at a normal distribution or a bell curve, what that means is that the values that are towards the center of the distribution are much more likely than the values that are on the fringes that are far above or far below the mean. Okay. And the bell, a bell curve can have a bunch of different characteristics to it. It can be wider, or it can be narrower, or it can be taller or shorter, depending on the distribution here. But we would need to know, that's what we would need to know. We would need to know the probability distribution of all these different possible.
Does there have to be a curve, a bell curve?
It's not necessarily. It doesn't. You could have a uniform probability, and if you roll a die, that's a uniform probability. You have the same probability of getting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. It's not like you have more probability of getting the middle values. Now, if you roll 2 dice and add them up, it actually does start to form a bell curve. Okay, so we're more likely to roll a 7 than we are to roll a 2 or a 12, and so on and so forth. And so. So a distribution doesn't necessarily need to be a bell curve. It's just that many naturally occurring things do happen to be, in the form of a bell curve, but that's not.
And what you're saying that is basically we don't know.
We don't know. That's what we're missing. Even if we grant that we have a firm idea of what the range of possible values would be, we still don't have that probability distribution, and so we can't really say. It might be a bell curve. It might not. It might be uniform. It might not. It might be an inverted bell curve. We in the math department at my school, we always kind of joke around how our grades, at the end of the semester when we fill out our grades, very often we'll have, a bunch of A students and a bunch of students that, we're getting D's and F's and not a lot of B's and C's. And so it's like an inverted bell curve. We have it separates into 2 groups basically. And so, we don't know if that's what's happening. We have no idea what that distribution looks like. And that's a key that we're missing there in order to come up with these probabilities.
Okay.
But along those lines, there was an article that I wanted to mention, and that it's from a website called phys.org, it's just a science reporting website. And this particular quote is from a journalist, not necessarily a scientist themselves. But it kind of sums up what I'm saying here. And I thought the wording was nice. And so that's why I'm going to bring it up here. It says, as scientists explain, the calculation of the number of universes is an important step towards an even larger goal. Okay. So learning about all the different variables in the universe and what they could be or what they couldn't be, that's an important step. And that is, we need to know the range of possibilities before we even begin to look at a probability distribution. But then the quote goes on to say, so it's a step towards an even larger goal, to find the probability of living in a universe with a particular set of properties. What are the chances that we live in a world in which the laws of physics are these laws that we currently observe? Answering this question requires finding probabilities that depend on knowing about other universes, among many other challenges. And so what that means is that we need to gather information about what's going on. We either we could do it. We could use the experimental approach. If we could get information from other universes, then we could start to develop a probability that way. Or if we had a strong model to represent the larger, the larger multiverse, I guess, or the superverse, or whatever we want to call it, the big U universe, I think we've called it in the past. We would have to have a strong model about how things work in that larger system. And so then we would have a strong model about how our universe began. And so then we could speak intelligently on that. So that would give us insight into that probability distribution. But speaking of mathematical models, we're one of the main argument against the idea that our universe is unlikely is, and this is, I think, is most popular amongst physicists nowadays, is this multiverse hypothesis, or multiverse hypotheses, I should say, because there's different variations of this multiverse. For example, maybe our universe is just a bubble, a bubble expanding within some larger medium, and maybe there's other bubble universes that are around us that we never interact with because the bubbles never touch. I mean, that's one possibility. Or maybe there's like different planes of existence, or your imagination can run wild.
So the idea is we find ourselves in a life permitting universe simply based on chance, because there are so many universes to pick from, so many little bubble or pockets of order or little universes. There's so many of them that we're bound to find some that are life permitting. Correct. So that's the general idea.
So if one even if we could show that one universe is unlikely to turn out this way, it's just like the lottery. If you buy a lottery ticket, you're unlikely to win, vanishingly unlikely to win. But people win the lottery all the time, and that's because there's repeated trials. That's because there's a lot of people buying tickets. And so even if we could demonstrate that our particular circumstances were very unlikely, if there's an infinite number of universes, or a huge number of universes, then that would make it much more likely that somewhere in a universe is like this is going to happen. And so then us as human beings, of course, we would appear, or we would come to be in the universes that allow humans to exist, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense that we would find ourselves in one of these other universes. And so if the chance that our universe is much more likely, or maybe even inevitable, then of course that's where we're going to be to observe and wonder how we got here, that kind of thing.
So if we do bring in the multiverse theory, we're going to have to grant these other possible universes, at least for the sake of argument, correct?
Right.
Because that's one thing the multiverse kind of goes on, is that there's other ways the universe can be, and it shows itself by having other pocket universes or other bubble universes. So
the same models that predict these other universes are what are being used to develop these numbers as to what these possibilities could be.
So if
we haven't checked, we haven't actually done any experiments on other universes.
We can't, right?
And,
So but if we did use that idea, then the lotto analogy I don't think is correct. The idea that, it's 20 million to 1, but someone has to win, right? So the idea is we have all these universes. You're bound to find yourself in a universe that's life, like our universe, right? So the question is, but I think that the true analogy is not why we find ourselves holding this one particular ticket, or why we find ourselves in this one particular universe, but why we find ourselves in a life-permitting universe at all. And so I think the correct analogy would be if you had a giant hopper with 20 trillion black ping pong balls and 2 white ping pong balls, and you mix the hopper up, and then you drew one ping pong ball from random. If it's black, then that count that as a life prohibiting universe, and if it's white, count that as a life permitting universe. And so the chances of us getting a white ball are so infinitesimally small compared to a black. And so that's the idea. Even if we do live in a multiverse, if that is in fact the case, we still have to grapple with, the multiverse now makes it possible for us to live because we have these infinite number of universes. But now we still have to grapple with the question of, why did we end up in a life permitting universe?
Right.
Why did we pull the white ping pong ball rather than the black all the billions of trillions of black
It seems amazing, doesn't it? It seems amazing, doesn't it?
Yes.
Right. But that's so that would be if we were assuming that it was just this one universe, right? Because you're only talking about one person drawing a ball out of the hopper.
No,
right?
I'm talking. So
so the hopper represents all the possible universes, right? And so we're not talking about one person drawing a ball out of the hopper. We're talking about, massive number of people, maybe even an infinite number of people drawing a ball out of the hopper.
I think we have maybe I didn't say it correctly.
Because there could be an infinite number of Jamies that got shot when they pulled the black ball, right? I mean, there could be an infinite number of Jamies, and you happen to be the one who drew the white ball. It was inevitable that one of those Jamies drew a white ball, and it just happened to be you, and you're like, oh my God, what happened here? How did I draw this white ball out of this big sea of black balls? Well,
right.
If we are working under the multiverse, hypothesis, then it's not just one person drawing a ball. It's millions and billions and maybe an infinite number of people drawing a ball. And so it's inevitable that one of them will draw the white ball.
No, I'm not sure about that. The question though is that why did this Jamie choose or able to get a life permitting universe over a life prohibiting universe?
Right.
So
and the reason why is that the Jamies that drew the black balls are not here to think about that question.
Okay, so that's the anthropic principle, right?
Right.
A whole idea that, hey, we're here, and if of course if things weren't life permitting, then we wouldn't be here to think about it.
Right.
And so if you want to I think something that helps kind of clarify that is kind of the analogy or the idea that let's say you, Scott, I'm going to use you instead of me because I've had issues with drugs before. So that hits a little too close to home. So let's say that Scott goes to Colombia, and I say Colombia because it's known for its drug running. And let's say that
and
he's
I've been
framed.
talking about wanting to go there for years.
And he's framed. Are you serious?
No.
Okay. He's framed for running drugs, and they take drug running seriously out there because, that was a bad thing. And so you're going to get a death sentence for that.
Okay.
And so, but the way they're going to kill you is by firing squads. So they line up 100 trained marksmen at nearly point blank range, and you're blindfolded, ready, aim, fire. You hear the roar of the guns, but then you realize that you haven't died, that you're still alive. Yeah. And but that doesn't answer the question, because you wouldn't say, no explanation is needed then, because if I had died, then I wouldn't be alive to be thinking this. But since I'm alive to be thinking this, no explanation is needed. But that's the very thing we're trying to. You would say, you would say, hey, this is rigged, or they all missed on purpose, or somebody moved me out of the way, or somebody put something in the way to stop it. So you would be expecting some kind of explanation for that. Exactly. And in the same way, that's what we're asking about. What we're asking about the multiverse or life permitting universe.
I think you highlight the error in perspective there. Okay. So we're looking at it from within, right? The anthropic principle. If people came to be, they're going to come to be in a situation that allows them to come to be. Right.
And in the same way. Right.
So in this case,
hold on. Well, let's line it up so that these are so that what you're talking about and what I'm talking about are like side by side.
Right. Okay.
Right. So you say that, okay, if we're going to come to be, we shouldn't be surprised that we're in a universe to come to be, because in order for us to come to be, we'd have to be in this particular universe, life permitting universe. The same thing would be said about the firing range. Is, you're blindfolded and all the guns go off, but you're still alive. Right. So those are kind of the same thing that we're talking about. But then the next question to ask is, why am I still alive? You
Right.
don't say, well, I'm still alive because if I were dead now, if they had shot me and killed me, I wouldn't be alive to think it.
Right.
We wouldn't immediately think that. We would go on to say, well, there must be some reason why I'm alive. They must have all missed. I mean, almost point blank range, 100 of them.
Right. And that's a natural thing that you would think. But let's say after that, okay, so after that, you learned that actually there was an infinite number of versions of you that were facing an infinite number of firing squads in an infinite number of Colombian, prisons.
Right.
Okay. And so out of an infinite number of possibility, if we're assuming that each person on the firing squad had a probability of missing, if there was a possibility that each one of them would miss, then even if it's vanishingly small, there's going to be a possibility that they all miss. And so if this happened an infinite number of times, then
Doesn't that just increase the probability though? I mean, it makes
my situation inevitable is what it does.
Right, but it still makes all the other times that you were shot infinitely more than the times you weren't shot. So the question is how did I end up?
No, the proportion is still the same. The proportion is still the same.
That's what I'm saying though. The proportion doesn't change. So
right.
So so if the proportion doesn't change, we don't have to posit an infinite amount of them. 100 will do. Okay, so
okay, yeah. So let's say that there's a 1% chance that they'll all miss, and when this happens 100 times, then it would be reasonable that one of those times,
right,
the person who was shot at would be wondering, well, why is it me, right?
Right. So that out of the 100 times, there's only one time that you end up alive. We wouldn't go, huh? I wonder, boy, that's interesting that I was the one that was in this particular one. We would want to know, man, how is it that I ended up, in this.
But if we understood what happened, then we would know how that happened. We would know. I mean, we wouldn't know why was it me instead of somebody else, but we would know that it was inevitable that one of us would have survived.
Right, and but the chances chances though are much greater that I would end up dead.
That version of you, right? And so, if our universe turned up this way, if there is a multiverse, then yeah, if the vast majority of them are inhospitable for life, then yeah, if you, Jamie, had been born in one of those universes, you would instantly die if it were somehow possible for you to be born there, of course. Mm-hmm. And so that would be. So maybe there are an infinite number of other, thinking beings that didn't, that never came to be because their universe didn't permit life. And so those would represent all of the ones that got shot. If it's inevitable that somebody's going to survive out of those, out of those infinite number of lineups or 1,000 or however many you want to do, if it was inevitable that one of them would survive, of course they're going to be wondering, gee, why was it me?
Right.
And because it was random chance, but it was inevitable.
Yes.
But it was inevitable that one of them would survive. That's the point. That's what the multiverse theory.
All right. So if you have the black ping pong balls, right, and the two white ping pong balls. Okay. So the black ping pong balls represent the multiverse, and the white ping pong balls represent. The
white ping pong balls are life permitting, right?
Yeah,
and the black are not life permitting,
right? And so our universe happens to be the one that drew of the trillions upon trillions upon trillions of black balls. We end up drawing the white one, correct?
Yep.
And but my question to you is, if we did it again and got the second white ping pong ball, what would you say then? Would you say, well, somebody had to get it? I guess it was.
If I knew that
I got it twice in a row.
If I knew that there was, in a massive number of people drawing balls, yeah, I would be surprised. Why was it me instead of somebody else? But
and that's all I'm saying is I think that those are the kind of probabilities we're dealing with. They're so high that if you grant that there's these theoretical possible ways our universe could have been. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm saying is that the odds are so mind blowing, almost beyond comprehension, that we would end up in a life permitting universe as opposed to a life prohibiting universe.
Right, but you're missing the point. You're missing the point of the multiverse example. Okay, you're missing the whole point there. If there is a massive number of trials, then it can become inevitable that somebody survives. Okay, bear with me. It's inevitable that somebody survives. You with me so far?
So are we talking ping pong balls, or are we talking the shooting range?
Sure. All right. We can stick with the ping pong balls. I guess we keep jumping back and forth between our analogies here. Okay, so let's stick with the ping pong balls then. Okay, so if let's say that there's 1,000 ping pong balls in there, and one of them is white. Okay, and we have 1 billion people drawing a ping pong ball. Okay, it becomes inevitable that somebody's going to draw the white ping pong ball. Mm-hmm. Or it actually is not inevitable, but it would be vanishingly unlikely that nobody picked the white ping pong ball.
Right.
Much more likely that at least one person, probably very likely that several of people would pick the white ping pong ball. Now, out of those people, obviously the people who chose the black ping pong ball are not considering their station in life at this point. Right? Because they're not thinking anything anymore. Okay. So of the people that drew the white ping pong ball, of course they're going to wonder, why was it me? And we can't give them an answer. Why was it you and not somebody else? But at least we can understand if we know, if we explain to them, oh, actually there was 1 million or 1 billion people that drew ping pong balls, and you were just, one of the ones who got the white one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't satisfy your curiosity, why me and why not somebody else, but it does answer the question about the probabilities, because it was inevitable that somebody would draw the white ping pong ball, and that person would be the only one in the position that could contemplate where they ended up, because the other people would not be contemplating shit anymore. Right?
I don't know.
Did I cross a line there?
Well, no, because it was like I was like so like in the zone, like sciencey thinking, and then all of a sudden that gets thrown out there.
I just brought you back down to earth. You're like, oh, it's just Scott. Jesus. Okay.
Right back in. All right. So okay, that's something that I probably need to chew on a little bit more, because I'm still not sure that that's right, but I think I need some time to think about why that might be wrong. or why that might be right. So
you don't know how, but it's got to be wrong. Somehow,
I'm not saying it's got to be wrong. I just am like I thought that my example directly corresponded with the situation.
And it does, but it's only but the way that you were saying it, you're only looking at it from the perspective of one of those universes. You're not considering the multiverse. You were looking at it from a perspective of, this is it. This is the universe. Right?
No, I was looking at it from perspective of, this is the one of the very few life permitting universes.
Right, but you were looking at it from the perspective of, you were the only person drawing balls out of the hopper.
Correct.
Right. But if that's not the case, then that explains why somebody survived. And we shouldn't be surprised at all that the people that did survive are amazed that they survived. Just like people who win the lottery every day. People win the lottery, right? We said that before. I guess I'm switching metaphors again.
Yeah, but but what we'd have to say there is that we would also be at that point speculating that, number one, there is a multiverse, and number two, that they're infinite in, or at least that there are so many of them that makes life permitting universe even a possibility, because we're talking series, super crazy.
Right.
There's so many more ways. If we're doing theoretical universes, so many ways universe could have been life prohibiting than life permitting. So we would just be speculating at that point whether or not that we have an infinite number, or we have enough, and why not 7? Why not 7 universes in the multiverse?
Right.
Instead of,
Right.
So I guess, yeah.
But for the context of the argument, first of all, if there is a multiverse, then we fully expect, if it's possible for there to be life-permitting universes, and we know that's really the only thing we have evidence for, is that it is possible to have a life-permitting universe because we're in one. We're experiencing it. We have firsthand information. So if there is a multiverse and we know it's possible for there to be a life-permitting universe, first of all, we're not going to be surprised that a life-permitting universe comes to exist. And secondly, we're not going to be surprised that if life does come to be in those universes, that they wouldn't understand, that they would be amazed that it happened. So, but do you get the difference between one person drawing the ping pong ball versus an array of people drawing the ping pong balls? So it's no longer surprising that there is a life permitting universe. And of course, it's not surprising that any life that arises, of course, will arise in a life permitting universe. And so none of that becomes unlikely anymore. So and that's what the argument depends on, is that this is unlikely. And so what we've described is a situation where it is unlikely or even inevitable.
So what if, let me see if I don't know if this is going to make any sense, but let's say
I'm crossing my fingers.
that Bob, his birthday is today, February 14th, right? Is today February 14th, Valentine's Day, yes. February 14th. And let's say that for his birthday, his wife got him a car, and on the, there's how many, probably millions of different variations of possible letters and numbers on a license plate. And so he wouldn't think it strange if he got like NPZ1256, right? Okay, it just seems pretty random. But if he got BOB0214, like at that point, would he be justified in saying, well, you know what? Even though we have all these license plates, BOB0214 is bound to come up somehow, so I shouldn't be surprised at all that it ended up on my car.
Well, it depends on his perspective. If he's looking at it as like it was just a one-shot deal, then of course he's going to be surprised. The odds of that happening are vanishingly small. But if you tell him, I know that there's billions of Bobs that got random license plates, and any of them that did not get BOB0214 winked out of existence. And so, of course, since there's so many possibilities, since there's so many trials, right? There's so many times that this is happening. Of course, it's going to come up a bunch of times.
Interesting.
If we did random choices, it's going to come up. If it has a non-zero probability of happening, and you do it an infinite number of times or a large enough number of times, it's going to happen, right? And so, and in addition to that, and this is where the anthropic principle comes into play. In addition to that, if the conditions to even wonder of your situation, if the conditions for you even to consider what's happening to you depend on that happening, then of course the only people considering their situation will be those Bobs that got that license plate.
Right. So I think that your first argument though was better than that one. So like the first part of that argument was better than that part, because you talking about having, having billions of Bobs getting cars on their birthday and getting license plates, and like, okay, I get that. I grant that. I need to think on that to see how that pans out. I need to think on it. But the other idea that, with the anthropic principle, that we shouldn't be surprised, right? I still think that makes us wonder, why me? So
of course we're going to wonder
Right.
that, because we have our limited perspective, because we don't know what all is happening. And so, yeah, that answer might not be very satisfying as to why am I here versus why am I not here. And that's fine, but that's not what the argument that we're looking at, the fine-tuning argument, doesn't hinge on somebody understanding why it's them. What the argument hinges on is this particular set of circumstances being unlikely. And so what we've described from our bird's eye view here of all this going on, we have a, the third person perspective here. We're looking on from the outside, right? And so what we're saying is, if we shouldn't be surprised that happens. I agree that it will not be a satisfying answer for the person whose perspective is limited to their own situation. They're going to be. In fact, it would be inevitable that they would think that also.
yes.
It's not only, it's not only likely that would happen, it's almost certain that would happen.
Okay,
right?
so
And
I do have a question. Okay, because I'm trying to, I'm trying to understand this. Okay, so let's just say we have that hopper of the billions and billions of black ping pong balls, and we only have 2 white ping pong balls, right?
All
so
right.
if we multiply the black ping pong balls, if we double those, and we also double the white ping pong balls, right? And we keep doing that, right? We're obviously going to have exponentially more black ping pong balls than we are white ping pong balls. Correct? So,
well, the proportion will stay the same, though. The percentage, your chance of drawing the white ball will still stay the same.
Right. But you're saying that now there is... I'm just trying to see how we jump from... let's keep it to a finite number, really big finite number, so I can understand it. Because I know there's different understandings of the infinite, and it's not my area. So let's keep it to like the highest finite number you could possibly think of black. All right. So just so my little mind, my peon mind can understand that. So let's.
Okay.
So
well, what the thing you just described that was supposedly easier to imagine is actually impossible to imagine. But let's just say a really big number.
Right.
Okay. Really big number.
Really. So I guess my question is if you have to have a life permitting universe in order to observe that you got the ping pong ball, wouldn't there be exponentially more life prohibiting universes? So let's just say we have 10 billion to 2. 10 billion life prohibiting to 2 life permitting. So say we double that. So we're going to keep everything still the same. So now we have, what did I say? Now we have 20 billion. What did I say at first?
4. You said
20,
10.
Yeah, 20. So 20 billion to 4. Right. And then double that again. So 40 billion to 8. Right. So I'm not seeing how
your probability of drawing would be the same.
Right. So I'm not seeing though how we're getting more observers. If we're working with these numbers, and you could only be an observer in a life permitting universe, I don't know how we're getting these other observers. So the first we had 20 billion to 4. So we had 4 observers, 4 people.
Well, we're talking hypothetically here.
Yeah,
right? We're talking hypothetically.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
So if it turned out that our universe was not life permitting, we wouldn't be here to be discussing this. But if one of these other universes turned out to be life permitting, then possibly, Jamie and Scott could be there having the same discussion. Okay, or at least there would be somebody there wondering why. And so what we're saying here, though, is that the multiverse is saying we don't just have one person drawing from the hopper. We have a large number of people drawing from the hopper. That's right, what the multiverse is saying.
That's directly proportion to the size of the hopper.
Right, but you have the same probability over and over and over again. It's going to hit one of these times.
Right.
We're not adding balls to the hopper. The hopper's still going to stay the same.
We are adding balls to the hopper. We're also adding life permitting universes to the hopper, right? So if you
can do it as long as the proportion is the same, then you can do that all you want. It's not going to change the probability of drawing a white ping pong ball.
Right.
It's
so I'm just wondering how we're getting though more life permitting universes. Like I see how they double, right? Like, so I went from 20 billion and 4 to 40 billion and 8.
The ping pong balls represent
the universe.
These range of numbers that allow, that could either allow or not allow life.
Right. Yes.
The universes that are popping up in the multiverse represent people drawing from the hopper to decide, am I going to be a life permitting universe or am I not going to be a life permitting universe?
Yeah. So
Okay.
So when the ball comes down the chute, if black,
we have more people drawing, it increases the chance of getting a white one.
So here's what I'm saying though. What? Listen, don't get frustrated. I'm really trying to understand this. Okay. So we have this giant hopper.
You're reading too much into my
your size
sounds. Yes.
All right. So we have this giant hopper with 20 billion black ping pong balls, and that is life prohibiting. And we have 2 white life permitting universes. Okay.
So the ping pong balls aren't the universes.
Yes, the ping pong balls are the universes.
Okay.
Right? So you pull the handle and you get a black ball. That is a life prohibiting universe, right?
Okay.
Then you toss that ball back in there and you pull the handle again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So you just keep doing that. You're working with the same proportions every single time because you have the same potential.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. We're not increasing the odds by.
You are.
No, because we're
if you buy 2 lottery tickets, you're more likely to win than if you buy 1 lottery ticket.
Not if the numbers are doubled. See, you want to double the amount of people, but while leaving the amount of.
No, that's not true.
Okay.
As long as your chance of winning is the same proportionally, then that doesn't affect anything. You still have the same probability. You still have a 1% chance of winning, 1% chance of winning, 1% chance of winning.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's 1 out of 100 or 10 out of 1,000
or 4 out of 40 billion or 4 out of 20 billion. Right.
Well, I mean, that would be a different proportion than what I was just saying. But so, 4 out of 20 or whatever, as long as the proportion is the same, the probability stays the same. And so if you repeat the process over and over again, you're eventually going to win or your chances of winning go up and up and up and up.
I don't know that they do if we're dealing with the same probability. We're dealing with the same probability every single time, aren't we? Don't we have the same probability every single time we pull the lever?
On any individual pull, you have the same probability, but we're accumulating multiple pulls now. Now we've pulled it 2 times, and so we're twice as likely to win. We pull it 10 times, we'll be 10 times as likely to win. It doesn't matter how many balls are in there, as long as the proportions are the same. You'll have the same probability per draw, right? Unless one draw affects the other one. But you said we're putting the balls back, and so
we're putting the balls back. Yeah, no, it doesn't.
Right. Okay. So as long as these are independent trials.
Mm-hmm.
If the more we try it, the more we're increasing our overall chance of winning.
Mm-hmm.
Just like if you buy 10 lottery tickets, you're more likely to win than if you buy 1 lottery ticket. As long as the probability is the same across all of the tickets, your chances of winning will go up.
But so let's say we have a finite number of lottery tickets. Let's say we have 20 billion lottery tickets.
Okay.
Right? And I play 1 ticket.
Uh-huh.
I have a 1 in 20 billion chance.
Right.
Right? Now, I'll play the lottery again the next day.
Okay.
Right? Same 20 billion to 1.
Right.
Every time.
So now during your 2-day span, you now have a 2 in 20 billion chance of winning.
No, you have a 2 in 40 billion chance, right? Because
no. 1 in 20 billion plus 1 in 20 billion equals, when you add fractions, you don't add the denominators too.
No,
you
I know
add
that. I'm just trying to think though. All right, I need some more time. I'm not kicking this can back. I just need more time to think about this ratio.
No, that's
so why don't we move on?
I'm a math teacher. I see it all the time.
Right, yeah, thanks.
So there's nothing new for me.
All right, so let's
that's not a judgment on you. It's
I know. I'm besting your chops.
It's not an insult to say that you're normal.
Well, I wouldn't go that far as say I'm normal, but let's go on. What are some of the other
So
here?
We talked about the premises, and so now let's talk about the conclusion here. So the conclusion was that the fine-tuning of the universe is likely the result of the design. And so what we need to know, though, is how likely is the universe to be designed? Even if we could determine how likely it was from chance, we can't say that it's more likely to be from design unless we know how likely it was to be from design. And so how do we determine that?
I don't think I understood that.
So if you want to say if something is more likely than something else, then you have to show that the probability of that thing happening is greater than the probability of the other thing happening.
Right. So if we said that, but if you ruled out necessity and you ruled out chance, then what you'd have left is design. Or
if we knew those were the only options, which we don't. Okay.
Well, that's true. We don't, but you also have to agree with me that the other possibilities don't have as much skin in the game, so to speak. Right? They're not as taken seriously as the other ones. Okay, necessity.
Well, even if that
chance.
were the case, we still don't have any basis for finding the probability of. See, the only way that you can say, everything else has to go to this option. You can't do that unless you know that's the only other option. And if we don't know that's the only other option, we can't say that.
I get that, but at what point do we say, because right now you're saying there's maybe some kind of other unknown option. But like I said, I could say that with anything, and we could never have then at that point any kind of statistical or probabilistic.
Any kind of argument that relies on knowing all of the options. But you can argue you can base an argument other than the strategy that's used in this argument.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how this will shape up if I use this on an argument you give. But we don't know this is the case. We have, there could be something else. We could just say that forever. So what I'm saying is I almost feel like that we should. But
not every argument depends on there not being something else. Sometimes
but also, do you think it's fair to insert something to chop down an argument that we're just complete conjecture, total speculation at that point, because we have no idea. Not only do we not know, but no one's even ever thought of anything else.
Well, I gave an example earlier
that it's a combination between necessity and
that
chance.
there could be some unknown naturalistic process going too.
That picks? Well, then that would be necessity, right? Because it's.
No, that wouldn't be necessity. That would be a contingent result, but it would be naturally caused.
So what would that look like? I'm not sure I understand that one.
I don't know what it would look like. Because it's an unknown naturalistic cause. It would be something causing the universe to be if you dump water on a hill, then the shape of the hill determines where the water goes, and that's a natural thing happening.
So if I think we talked about this before, and I can't remember exactly what you said, but if we just got a basketball hoop, and let's just say that my son has a habit of knocking that thing over, and let's say I come home one day, pull in the driveway, I see the basketball hoop knocked over. I have a couple options. and Carissa, my wife, says, "Hey, how'd that basketball hoop get knocked over?" I could say, "Well, babe, it was. I think it might have been windy, so it could have been the wind, or the neighbor. He's kind of a little jerk kid, little butthole, runs around, knocks things over. Could have been him, or Camden could have knocked it over, like he's done 5 other times, or something we don't know."
Right.
I'm not sure my wife would be satisfied with that last one.
Right, but you know enough about your son, you know enough about the brat next door, you know enough about the wind that you can at least come up with ballpark probabilities for those, and you can compare those with each other.
Well, and so I think that's what they're trying. I think that's what they're trying to do with necessity, chance, and design.
But you're comparing a probability that that we don't know to another probability that we don't know. You know, we don't have experience with other universes. We don't know this, and even if we're working under the assumption of these multiverse models, we still don't know the probability distribution. So we don't know the probabilities. We just know, we can just list off a bunch of things that might happen, just like you just did. We could list off 50 things that could have knocked it over. In fact, just by saying people could knock it over, we have over 7 billion options right there. We don't know, but you're comparing things that you know about your son. He's knocked it over 3 times in the last week.
It's not like, but listen, if we're going to invoke the multiverse, though, or as a, like thinking about theoretical, hey, let's think about this, then I think it's fair to say that we do know something about these other universes. Like if we know enough to speculate about the multiverse, then I think we have to also say that we know something about these other theoretical universes as well. So I don't think it's without.
The only thing we know is that our model predicts that they're happening. So even if we're working under that assumption that the model's correct and that the model predicts that these things could happen, it doesn't tell us anything about the probability distribution. And so
there could be 3 of them, or there could be an infinite.
Well, it's not just the number. It's not just the size of the bullseye. It's the size of the bullseye compared to the size of the board. We have to know the distribution. Let me give you an example of this here. And I know we've done a ton of examples on this, but what do you think the probability of me winning a fight with my brother is?
I'd have to know. I know so you. I know that you're kind of a badass.
I have a black belt in Taekwondo.
Right. Yeah.
But so does my brother.
Oh.
So does my brother. Although I have a lot more fighting experience than he does, but he's a little bit bigger than me. He's like an inch or two taller than me. He's got like 10, 15 pounds on me.
Yeah.
He's got a little bit longer reach, and he's younger. And maybe his knees are a little better than mine, and that kind of thing. So there's pros and cons for both of us. So you'd maybe ballpark it, maybe you'd start with like a 50-50 guess because you figure we're kind of the same. We have the same parents. And so maybe we have the same, physical build and so on. And, but, then I'll say, well, I've been doing Taekwondo for 30 years and my brother quit for 25 years in the middle. So, I've been doing it a lot more. So maybe you'd say like, 60-40 or 70-30 or something like that. Okay. So that's out of 2 of us. Right. And so you can come up with kind of a ballpark figure there. But now, let's say instead of me fighting my brother, I'm going to fight 10,000 one-year-olds. What do you think my chance of winning is going to be fighting 10,000 one-year-olds? Sure.
Oh. Well, I mean, I don't know because you could
pretty much guaranteed. I think, right?
I don't know.
Just walk down the line, just knock him over.
You might die of a heart attack. Oh, you're talking about actually winning the fight. Right, so not dying of like a heart attack or exhaustion from throwing punches, but So
what I'm saying is that it's not just the number of things that are involved, right? So if it was just me and my brother, we could maybe say 60-40 or whatever. But even though if I'm saying it's me, well, maybe 10,000 is too. Well, you get the idea though. Yeah. Me against 1,000 one-year-olds, even though there's more people involved, my probability has gone up. And it's not just because of the number of possibilities. It's because of the relationship between myself and the other competitors. If I'm facing my brother, we're fairly even matched up for, with various, things going my way, various things going his way.
Right.
But if I'm facing the one-year-olds, then it's different. The relationship between me and my opponent is different. And so even the fact that there's way more possibilities, if I'm fighting 10,000 one-year-olds, then there's 10,001 competitors. And yet my probability of winning is near certain.
Right. But
if we say that there could be all these other different universes, we don't know if we're a me facing my brother situation or if we're in a me facing 10,000 1-year-old situation.
Okay.
That's where that probability distribution comes in.
Okay. So, and that's where so you would probably fall back on that, and I would probably fall back then on what we had talked about earlier with that principle of indifference, correct? Where it not being given anything to think otherwise, we should consider all things being equal.
Right. A principle of indifference is more of a discussion tool, but we're talking about forming a logical argument here. And so we need something with a little more teeth. The principle of indifference is just we want to have a conversation, so let's assume this.
But so we couldn't use that even on Bayesian theory?
We could use it, but then our
is less than certain.
Our conclusion would be under the assumption that assumption was true.
Okay.
And so if we didn't know whether or not that assumption was true, that's where our confusion will come in there. That, the fact that we can't come to the conclusion is not because of our reasoning, it's because of the uncertainty of our assumptions.
Okay. All right. Well, a lot to think about here with probability, and I've had enough of the analogies, at least for one night.
Let's go back to the what we were talking about then. Yeah. So how can we determine how likely it is that it was designed? If we haven't eliminated all other possibilities, what are we going to base that on? How do we know? How can we compare something that even if we did know the probability that our universe turned out this way, even if we assume that it was very unlikely, how can we assume then that it was more unlikely to be designed? I mean, for one thing, a designer, I'm assuming you said something about intention. So a design has to come from a designer. So we're talking about something that's alive, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so obviously it's not something, it's not something that's alive in this universe.
Correct.
And so you're saying there has to be the possibility of life outside this universe. Now, do we have any evidence for that? Do we have any reason to think that's even possible? Because we do have evidence that this universe is possible.
Right.
Do we have any kind of evidence that a designer is possible? Because if a designer is not possible, then the probability of it being designed is 0.
Okay.
Which would be less than any, no matter how small the probability of our universe is, the probability 0 is going to be lower.
Okay. Yeah, I get that.
So where does that leave us then? If we don't know that a designer is even possible, then we can't even begin to compare that.
Yeah, I think this is something that we would probably just keep going round and round. And that might not be satisfying to you, but like I said, I think that at some point you would probably have to try and justify why you think it's necessity, why you think our universe.
I never said that. Well, I didn't. I don't think it's necessity.
But you try to rule that in as a possibility. And so I think you'd have to give reasons why you think.
No, I'm not ruling it in as a possibility. I'm saying we haven't ruled it out as a possibility.
Right. Well, we're not talking about Cartesian certainty either. We're talking about Bayesian theory. Okay.
I'm talking about reasonable certainty.
All right. Yeah. And so but that's what I'm saying. Then we have to weigh what you say about necessity to justify the possibility of necessity with. But
all I've said about necessity is that we haven't ruled it out.
Okay. But that's
all I've said.
Okay. No, okay. Well, I get that.
Okay. Well, then I have one last thing to say.
Yeah.
So what would it take? Why is it unlikely that a justification can be found? I'm going to say that I think it's unlikely that we will get evidence that will support this conclusion, and here's why. So let's look at why. The two different types of justification we could give for that probability. The experimental probability. If we could gather experimental probability on how universes begin, then that would mean that the multiverse is true, that there are massive amounts of universes out there, or at least to the extent that we can gather data.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, that would make the likelihood of a universe like this popping up be much more likely, possibly even inevitable. And so if we had evidence of the multiverse, which that's what would be needed to have experimental results to supporting that probability, then that's not a problem. Yes, it does show that our universe, that one instance of our universe is unlikely, but it also shows that we have a huge number of trials, and that makes the chances that the universe coming at all very likely. The other possibility is for us to have a theoretical probability. And we talked about how in order to develop a theoretical probability, you have to have a strong understanding of the mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we did have a strong understanding of the mechanisms, then that would support the idea of a naturalistic, or at least a scientifically, an origin of the universe that is scientifically investigable, if that's a word. Investigable, we can investigate it.
Right. Right.
And so that would demonstrate a natural origin to the universe, which would, of course, undermine
well, so
the
do you
ultimate.
Think, I mean, there's certain atheists that would say that we could have an external non-temporal agent who could work in the universe where you could actually, like, when I asked or somebody asked somebody, how could we demonstrate that if we're only looking at the natural and what we're talking about super, and they claim that, well, you could have something that's demonstrable in the physical world that was brought on by something unnatural or supernatural.
So if something was supernatural and it had an effect on the natural world,
right? That it could be demonstrable if that were the case. So, that there is ways that we can measure or whatever natural things brought on by a supernatural agent.
Oh, okay. So I see what you're saying. So you're saying that was to my last point, right? You're saying that if we could investigate, or if we could develop a strong model, then that doesn't rule out that doesn't necessarily mean that the model would be of a natural cause. Correct.
That if we could, that it would be that it's possible that it's a supernatural cause, but we're still able to discover that in the natural world. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember who's the atheist in the well-known bald atheist from Texas, Austin, Texas. He does
Matt Dillahunty?
Yes, that's who it was. Yes, it was Matt Dillahunty. He debated a guy,
well-known bald atheist from Texas. That's his
boom. That's his calling
card. That's on his business card right there.
Yeah, that's right. I've been watching a lot of his stuff because he just has been popping up left and right, debating some of these other Christians, and he was debating the guy from Inspiring Philosophy, and that's one of the things that got brought up. And he had mentioned that we could demonstrate a supernatural cause in a natural way.
He was saying that we could, if there was something supernatural that had an effect on the natural world, we could measure the effect.
Right.
But what we couldn't do is show that it was from a supernatural cause.
Oh, well, see, it seemed to me the way he said it was that was at least a possibility, because the other guy asked, well, how am I able to demonstrate that then? And then Matt Dillahunty said, well, you could demonstrate it if it was the case. And you could because it, so I'm thinking that maybe that's
I don't know the particular debate that I haven't seen that, so I can't speak to what Matt has or has not said, but I've heard him say many times that, we could, if something had an effect on the natural world, we could measure that effect, but that we couldn't attribute it to, we couldn't demonstrate using the tools we have available to us. I believe Matt is a methodological naturalist, as I am. and that we're limited to the tools that we have. Our investigation is limited by the tools we have. But Matt has said many times that that we can't demonstrate supernatural causation because, at the very least, because of the tools we have available to us. I'm not saying that. I've heard him say that many times. I can't say, what he said at that particular debate, though.
Yeah, I'll send you a link, because that was interesting. Because that came off the heels of another debate when somebody asked him if I parted an ocean in Jesus' name, would that be evidence for something supernatural? And he said no. And then he asked him, what if I cut someone's head off here, or cut your head off, and then reattached it? Would that be evidence of something non-natural, or possibly something super? Right. And he said no.
I think we're straying, but we're straying kind of from our topic. But I think, and again, I haven't heard everything that Matt has ever said, but he has said on more than one occasion that we can't demonstrate supernatural causation. If somebody parted the sea in Jesus' name, and again, from the things that I've heard Matt say, my guess is that he would say, well, all we know is that somebody said something about Jesus, and then we saw the waters part. We don't know if he actually caused it. We don't know if it was a God causing it. We can't prove that. We can't demonstrate that supernatural causation. But if you'll give me a minute here, I was about to agree with you, okay, and say that you're right. If we did have a strong model of the origin of the universe, it would not necessarily indicate that the origin of the universe was natural. Okay. Yeah. So you're right. So that was a good point that you brought up there.
Wow. Mark that down. What's the time
You've
on
been
that?
saying that a lot. You've been saying that a lot lately. And I think that the more that you say that, I think it kind of weakens the effect, right? It's supposed to say, oh, write it down because that's rarely happening. Write it down again because that's rarely happening. Write it down again because it's still rarely happening.
I'm just saying, anyway. Well, at least we could have a probability there, couldn't we? Because we could go back, we could see how many trials we had, right? Yeah.
But my point here, though, is that if we look back at the argument, premise one, okay, we didn't, the only problem I had with premise one was making sure we had clearly defined terms, and we came to agreement on terms. I don't think we have a problem there.
Right.
Premise two, that kind of leaves the door open. We don't know if those are the only options, but that's okay. Even if we did know that they were all the options, we still don't know how likely our universe is. We don't have that probability distribution, and we can't determine that without more knowledge. I'm not saying that we could never know, but we don't now. And then the conclusion, we still don't know how probable the design would be. We don't know how probable it would be a design, or if even that was even possible.
Okay.
And so we can question the validity of the argument, and we can also question the soundness of the premises, and then of course the conclusion. So I think, to me, this is like the worst argument for a God that there is. Because for me, I look at this and it's just all one big giant argument from ignorance. It's based off of what we don't know, and it seems to be. And I'm not saying that
really,
you can't
because
you can't make an argument in that.
And this is where we might just have to say, okay, we're going to have to put the gloves down and let our audience decide, because I would say I would go back to the first part where you're talking. Of course, we agreed on premise one for the most part. In premise two, I think that I could show some kind of justification for how they come up with the probability for these other possible universes, and that if we come up with this ungodly number of universes that are inhospitable, and only one or two that or only one or two that are life permitting, that we should be surprised that we're in a life permitting, and the odds of that are insurmountable in my mind. And so that would then put us to either necessity or design, because like you said, we can't rule out necessity. I'll grant you that, because you will say that there could be a possible, we don't know. And so
Well,
I'll
I didn't say we can't eliminate. I said we haven't.
Well, and I would agree with you that if you throw in there's always something we don't know if we don't know, we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. And that could be, to me, that just seems almost like it was begging the question. I think we talked about that. I don't know if we talked about it earlier before we turned it on.
But I can't be begging the question because I'm not making an argument. I'm criticizing this argument.
Yeah, but you're also saying too that, well, listen, we're already almost at 2 hours, so we can't continue to beat this into the ground. So,
you obviously have not been listening to. We can beat it into the ground deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
You underestimate our ability.
No, the question is, do we want to beat it into the ground?
Right, that's fine.
Deeper? And I'm not sure that we do.
Well, if and when you can come up with those justifications, then we can revisit.
Okay.
I'm saying what we've talked about here today, we haven't.
In your opinion, I haven't given the justification.
Correct.
Okay. I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Because I, in my opinion, I think I have or I can, but that's why.
Okay, so what is it? Tell me. We had talked about this, right?
So we're an hour and 50 minutes in.
So you don't want it. So you say that you say that you have given the justification, but you won't say what it is?
No, I think I already have, right? I mean, are we really going to continue to rehash this? That's my point, is that at some point we get to a sticking point where we say, no, I think so. And you say, yes, it is. I say no.
Fine.
I mean, so
if we want to, if we want to stop here, then that's fine with me.
I mean, we could, I would love to go back, because the more I read on this, the more stones are unturned, and I'm just finding new stuff all the time on this. And so I would love to go back the more I learn about this and revisit it.
Okay. I'll be here.
That was
any last words?
That was way better.
Any last words before you draw a ping pong ball from the hopper?
I'm dead. I'm a dead man.
Not if you do it an infinite number of times.
That's right. I got to go spend some infinite time with my finite wife, or I am going to be pulling the black ping pong ball.
All right.
In the shadow of death.
That wraps up, at least for now, ... the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jamie.
And that was the fine-tuning, not so fine-tuned. So that was actually our second go.
Was.
The first one, you made me cry. So we had to do it a second time.
It was not pretty. It was not pretty.
And that just goes to show our audience that these conversations are not easy, especially when you're talking about these foundational issues, these things that are really, really to our core. And so you really have to have this kind of tenacity. Like, okay, I'm come hell or high water, I'm getting through this conversation one way or the other.
Right.
And I think we both kind of have that in our DNA, kind of that, we're going to push through and get it done.
That could be, yeah. It could be nature or nurture, or a combination of both.
Yes, it could be. And so I think that was one of the things that kind of got us through. And also, it's you and I are obviously able to compare the first go around with the second go around. And I think, we talked about some things and we made some changes, and that made for a more all in all productive, I think, podcast.
Certainly more, I don't want to say civil. I thought we were civil the first time through, but it just got heated and we had kind of a breakdown of communication. I think it would be the best way of describing it. And I think this is good because it just goes to show that contrary to the way we sound on the podcast, we are not highly polished professional speakers.
No, we are not.
We're just a couple of guys that try to talk about stuff. And sometimes it works out and once in a while it doesn't, but I think we're getting better at it. And we were able to bounce back and, have a good second time through, I think.
Yep. Get back on the horse. And so I thought we had a good discussion. All right.
Yeah.
So let's move on from there and go into the God or Not book club.
All right.
This is the God or Not
biggest book club meeting in the world.
Okay, Jamie, so we're ready to talk about our next installment of the God or Not book club here, and we're talking about Sense and Goodness Without God, A Defense of Metaphysical Naturalism by Richard Carrier. And for this time, we read the second half of chapter 3. And so just give a quick rundown. There's a couple of things that I thought were interesting that I think would be worth digging into deeper, but just want to just do a quick summary of what our reading covered. So the first idea that we looked at in this section was the nature of the mind. And this was a big one. It talks about the nature as a virtual reality, talks about the possibility of looking at the mind as a machine and also looking at machines as minds. Talks about the evidence for mind-body physicalism. So the idea that the mind is just it's a physical process and part of the body. He also briefly touched on the meaning of life. I'm assuming he's going to kind of dive into that a little bit deeper in later chapters. He also gave a very brief summary of the science of things like biogenesis and evolution and so on. And he finished up talking about the nature of reason and our capacity to reason as human beings, and emotion as subsets of things that were of the mind. And so my first thought was about the nature of mind. I imagine that you believe that you're probably a mind-body dualist. Would that would that qualify?
Yeah, usually, at least from what I've heard, he talks about the mind as being physical, and I know this is just verbiage, but usually, like when I think about it, I talk about the brain as that physical instrument,
right,
and then the mind is being that kind of that metaphysical, that your spirit or your soul, that first mover type of thing. But I know what he's talking about. So yeah, I mean, I would be a dualist, that we have a physical body or a brain, and then we also have a spirit or a soul, and I would probably call that the mind.
Okay. Yeah, he did the same thing. Actually, there was a finer distinction in there. The brain obviously is physical, like a literal part of our body, and he described the mind as an activity that the brain does.
Right.
Thinking is something that the brain does, and so a mind is just an example that I like to use. And he didn't say this in the book, but like running. Running is a physical activity. You can't like grab it and put it in a bucket or anything, but running is something that your legs do. And so we can talk about running, and we can talk about characteristics of running, and similar kind of thing when we're talking about the mind. I think that's kind of the point that he was getting at with, talking about the mind as activity in the brain. But one thing jumped out at me, because I know that you're interested in not out of body experiences, but near death experiences. And so he talked a lot about, a fair amount about near death experiences. I'm curious in particular of what you thought about that section.
Yeah. The thing that I almost wanted to ask him, if I could, is he talked about, a lot of that, these, what he called NDEs, near death experiences, can be chalked up to kind of things, hallucinations and tricks kind of that your mind plays on us as it's oxygen starved and as it's dying. Yeah. And I guess my question, I think the crux of the issue comes into when you have someone who has no traceable heart electrical activity and no traceable brain activity. So if your brain isn't functioning, how can you hallucinate? And there have been verifiable, probably a dozen, maybe 24. I mean, there are several. I mean, there are thousands upon tens of thousands of people who say they've had near-death experiences. Of those, there's probably about 200 that would be considered verifiable. Of the verifiable ones, I would probably put a couple dozen as being really good. The ones that I would put up. Some of the other ones are a little shoddy.
So what do you mean by verifiable? What do you mean by that?
That there
How do you verify that somebody is having a near-death experience?
That it was confirmed that the person had no heart, no brain activity,
right?
And that they experienced something that they couldn't have experienced otherwise. For instance, I know in one case, I don't have the details off the top of my head, but I know in one case, a person said that they left their body and they went down the block. Their body went down the block and saw a car wreck, and he was able to describe the car wreck in detail. And this was in a position he wasn't in a position where he could have known about this car wreck or known about these kind of things. So that's what I mean by verifiable, that you actually have doctors and nurses say, yep.
But how do they know that he was having that experience at that time?
Because the car wreck happened during the time when he was, quote, dead, had no heart, no brain activity. And when they woke up, they said, hey, listen, I had this experience about this. It was like, so I left my body. There was this car wreck. It was a motorcycle versus a, van or this and that. So they're able to kind of put two and two together because it was during the time.
But his brain was functioning when he relayed the story.
Right. So he was he was alive at that point.
Right.
That he came back.
So I guess that would be maybe we can have a separate episode on this where we can get into this a little more deeper. I guess just to give you kind of a little seed to get you rolling is, how would you know that he had that experience while his brain was dead, basically?
Well, because
not either before or after.
Well, there would have been no way for him to know. So know that there was a car wreck and the details of it.
Well, okay. Well, let's talk more about that in a different episode. There was one other thing. Go ahead. Finish up.
I just thought that he too quickly dismissed the NEDs, especially those, like I said, those probably dozen or two that would really be considered verifiable. I think he kind of too easily dismissed those. But, this wasn't a book on NDEs. He obviously he's covering every kind of topic you could think of in this book.
Right.
So he couldn't go too much in depth, but I would be curious to see what he thinks about the work of somebody like Gary Habermas, who has done extensive work and is considered a subject matter expert on it. So,
okay. So we'll table that. That's kind of what I was, what I thought that you'd say, but so we'll set that aside. There was one other thing that was a point of interest for me, and I really appreciated the way that he presented evolution. He didn't talk too much about evolution, but I really enjoyed, because very often we hear people talking about evolution and so on, and they really focus just on biological evolution by natural selection. And so I like the fact that Carrier, first of all, defined evolution. Basically, the fact he separated the fact of evolution, which is that living creatures have changed over the time, over the years, and the mechanism of evolution, which is natural selection.
Right.
And so that was I like that he made that distinction there. And then he talked about how natural selection is the explanation of the observation.
Right.
And, but then he also dove a little bit deeper into the philosophical aspects of natural selection. He talked about, the basis, that it's just based on three concepts: the idea of reproduction, the idea of variation in that reproduction, and then competitive survival for to reproduce the next generation. So I like that he separated that, because if you look at it from the philosophical perspective there, without the specifics from biology, then you can apply it to a variety of different situations. And he applied that to the biological development, of course, and then also to like social development, social evolution. And so it was really interesting to see two different perspectives on that. What were your thoughts when you were
I was
that part?
I was surprised because I hadn't ever heard that before. the distinction being made.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, most everything that's out there is specifically honed in on biological life and how we've adapted over time and how, common ancestry and things like that. So for him to separate the two like that, and of course, evolution isn't my forte, so I'm limited on my scope in that. But that was the first time that I had heard it broken down like that, and I appreciate the fact that he was able to do that.
Cool. So was there anything particular that you wanted to talk about out of the reading there? Because it covered a fair amount of ground.
He did. He covered a lot, and like I said, this book really runs the gamut. If it has anything to do with a worldview, man, it's in there. So I appreciate his his desire to cover all ground there. I would say the one thing that also struck me when he was talking about the mind, and how there have been studies that where things happen in our brain physically before we kind of even know that that's going on. Almost as a hey, this is best described in naturalism. And I know one of the things, I think maybe we had talked about this before, but I'm not sure. One of the analogies that I had read about this from a theistic perspective is that the brain is like a piano. And that the pianist, the person playing the piano, is that will, is the soul, is that first mover. And so obviously, I, Jamie, me as a person, I'm using my mind or my physical brain in which to communicate at this point. And so if anything's, so there would be that kind of lag. Or possible lag, if I'm using my mind like a pianist would use.
It's like your body's making a long distance phone call to your mind, and so there's like a couple of seconds.
Yeah,
lag in there.
There could be a lag there. Also, too, he talked a lot about if the brain gets damaged and if things, things get cut out or moved, and we could determine right where things happen. And that's one of the things I thought about too in that analogy is, I could bust up a bunch of the keys on the piano, which would severely affect my ability or the pianist's ability to play that piano. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I am the piano, if that makes sense. And so, you could have some things in your brain. You could have a physical defect, or you could have an accident where now you are affected. And so you, as the first person, the mover, the will, can only communicate in as much as your physical brain will allow you to do that. So at least I didn't hear him cover maybe that aspect of it. So I was
sorry, finish up.
No, I was just wondering maybe what he would say to that.
I think he did address the first thing that you brought up about the lag in the because he talked about how, because the reason that it's these experiments that they've done are fascinating. I mean, they've done experiments where they like have somebody push a button and by they put electrodes and EEG machines or however they do the sensing with the brain activity, but they can tell that the decision to push the button. So they tell these people, just push the button whenever you want to, and they can detect that when the person decides to push the button by certain types of activity, but then they can also sense when you become conscious of that by looking for activity in the conscious portion of the brain. So they compare the decision making, so they relate both of those actions to brain activity in different areas of the brain. Like the decision making goes on in one particular area of the brain, and then the conscious awareness of that decision. Because then after the person presses the button, they ask them things like, well, when did you decide to push the button, and that kind of thing.
Right.
And so they correlate so it's more than just It would be, well, let's see if I can relate it to your telephone analogy. Well, they can tell. I mean, they can measure the brain activity that does the decision making, and then they can also measure the brain activity that does the that's related to the awareness of the decision. And so that's the correlation that they're making there. I don't know if he specifically addressed the what you were talking about with the brain damage. I mean, obviously, if that was the case, if there is like some kind of physical conduit from your body to your, if you have a disembodied mind or something like that, then, that would make sense that if there's a body portion of it, the body could break down. I don't know. Right. I don't know how you'd investigate that, but it was interesting. Was there anything other than that you wanted to bring up?
I think that he's very bold. I think that he's very bold, and I think he's maybe, just in my opinion, maybe a little overconfident. Of course, it is his book, and he's promoting, a certain worldview. But I know in the philosophy of the mind, and I think he did say this, but it just seemed to me that it was kind of almost in passing, that the more that we learn about the brain or the mind, the more we're fascinated by the complexity, and the more confused almost we are. Like, we'll learn a few things, and so we'll do some experiments or things.
I don't know. I don't know if I'd say we're confused, but we certainly learn.
Ground, but then there's also opens up a whole nother Pandora's box of kind of mystery. Well, we don't know how that works. Like we could see it working physically, but we can't correlate certain things. So I think that it's that the mind. Philosophy of the mind and understanding the mind is I don't think we're going to understand it completely anytime soon.
Well, he came to a different conclusion there. He thought that we'd be able to at least simulate a mind with artificial intelligence. I think he said 2030. Yeah, that's what he said.
That's pretty bold. But something, I tell you what, I can't remember who told me that almost, I think they said every year, or maybe even less than that, technology exponentially grows as far as the vastness and our depth, our ability to do certain things with technology, that we have just gone so far. And if that continues at that pace, I don't know if we're going to hit a ceiling, so to speak, or a plateau at some point as far as technology goes. If we don't, then maybe we'll be able to simulate something. Now, whether or not that is actual conscious agent, who knows? I mean, that's right. Boy, that's
now's the time we should be talking about it.
That's right. Yeah, that's true.
But because we don't want to, wait till after the fact and then realize we've been, torturing computers for years.
Right.
But speaking of the exponential growth of computer ability, so consider this also. At some point, we're going to get to a point where we can design computers that can design themselves. And that's when it's really going to take off. I mean, because a human being could sit down and think about how to redesign a computer, or how to come up with develop a new material or a new configuration, or even more efficient software, that kind of thing. But once a computer can think much more quickly than a human being can. And so, once the computers get to a point where they can redesign themselves, then it's just going to increase at it's going to be mind-boggling rates.
Straight up like 1988 Terminator. That's the only
Skynet. Right?
As
Skynet.
he was going through some of that stuff, that's what I was thinking of. I'm like, man, we are gonna be in some trouble here as they rise up to take over the world.
Right. Well, we'll probably be still around in 2030, so maybe we can. We'll be celebrating our 10-year anniversary of the God or Not podcast.
Yes,
so maybe we can take some time in the year 2030 and we can revisit. Old Richard Carrier here and see how his predictions have come true or not.
If I have to make a prediction on that, which I think I'm going to pontificate for about 5 seconds here, I think we're going to hit a ceiling. I think that we'll get to a point where we could expand out to the left and to the right, so to speak. But I don't know how much further up we can go. Like, I think there's still some room, But I think we're going to get to a point where we're going to hit a ceiling, and it's just going to be either too great a mystery for us to grapple with, or outside of our abilities, at least at the present. I think that's what they're experiencing a little bit in physics. They're creating those colliders, and in order to get the kind of speed they need, they would need a collider as big as the world, in order to move forward. So I think they might be reaching, in some respect, some of that in physics. So it's going to be interesting to see if we can gain some ground or make some progress in actually both of those fields.
There's bound to be bottlenecks to development, right? There's going to be, we have our own understanding and our own development, but then we also have things like materials development and so forth. And so, a lot of times those things progress at different rates. And so sometimes we stumble on this really awesome superconducting material and we can make this new computer, that goes, 1,000 times faster or whatever, but then it takes a little while for our understanding of the other aspects of the system to catch up. Right. And, so different things are going to be advancing at different rates at different time. But yeah, I'm looking in some ways I'm looking forward to it. And in some ways it's actually kind of terrifying. Maybe we could have an episode on artificial intelligence at one point, because I know there's lots of different opinions out there. Yeah. You got some people that say that, artificial intelligence is going to decide that human beings are a problem,
a threat,
and and send out the Terminators after us. Right. But then again, on the other hand, they might be more enlightened and more benevolent than even we are. So it's tough to say. It's really it's kind of wide open. So like I said, it's exciting, but also kind of scary. But anyway, we're digressing from the book. And so any last words about our reading for this time?
I'm actually enjoying the book more than I thought I would.
All right.
Yeah. So we'll see what the next chapter has to offer.
Well, for the next section, we're going to be reading all of chapter 4. And so for those of you with the print edition of the book, it's going to be page 209 through 290. And so this chapter is called What There Isn't. And so it's going to be talking about paranormal phenomenon and also atheism. It's going to address the idea of atheism. So it's going to be chapter 4. I'm not sure how that will translate to the audiobook.
It's been a hot mess. Trying to figure out exactly what is what. So
right.
I may have listened. I may have listened ahead the other day. So
okay, well, good. You got a head start on me then. That's going to be, and so we will. Let's see. So if anybody wants to chime in on that particular section, we would like to. Let's see. This episode is hitting the airwaves on the 21st. We had a little late production this time around because we had some technical issues, but let's see. So when is the next one going to be?
It's going to be March.
So for releasing
3rd,
March 3rd. Okay. So then we'll need feedback by like the middle, like February 25th or 26th, maybe 27th, somewhere around in there. So if anybody is following along with us and wants to chime in, please feel free to do so. Or you can also, comment on the previous sections too. And it doesn't have to be exactly on the pages that we're reading, but anyway, so that's chapter 4, page 209 to 290. And that's the God or Not Book Club.
That was the God or Not Book Club. Let's jump right into Spin That Wheel.
Spin that wheel.
Okay, and so here we have one of our favorite bits here called Spin the Wheel, where Jamie and I each, we spin the wheel and we pick a random question out of the hat for each other to answer. Now, Jamie hasn't heard any of the questions that I'm about to answer, and vice versa. So we'll start, and I will spin the wheel for Jamie, and here we go.
All right, baby.
Okay, Jamie, and before I tell you your question here, I have to come clean and admit that I handpicked this one today.
Oh, great!
And so I didn't. So it wasn't randomly selected. And the reason that I did that is because, and there's a little bit of backstory here. but we'll get to the questions soon enough. Because today, we're recording today, and it's Friday, February 21st. And so today I didn't have class at my school. And so instead we had a faculty development day, and our keynote speaker, his name escapes me, but he was a speaker from, actually, coincidentally, a Christian college, but he came to talk to us about the value of dialogue, And I know that's something that we struggle with on this podcast here. But one thing that he talked about was there's three ways that we can describe what we're doing here, or at least three ways: debate, dialogue, and discussion. And so if we look at the word debate, if we look at the origins of the word debate, it's based off of which is expressing reversal, and batiri, which means to fight. And so basically it's like you're fighting back, or, fighting to change something, or fighting to change somebody's mind. So I thought that was an interesting little backstory on the word debate. Now compare that to the word dialogue, which is dia, which in this case refers to through, like something going through something else. And I'm not entirely sure how I would pronounce this, legine or legein, which is to speak. And so a dialogue is like talking through something. And so speaking through something. And then the third word was discussion, which is based on the word discutere, which means to investigate. So those three words, although we very often use those words interchangeably, debate, dialogue, discussion. Yeah. They have a so debate is more of a combat oriented, or fighting to change somebody's mind. Dialogue is like talking something through, and discussion, which is kind of a joint investigation. And so my question to you is going to be, it's both easy and hard because it's open-ended. Right. And I'm assuming that hopefully that this will lead to maybe a longer discussion that we have on this topic. But keeping those three words in mind, what are your thoughts on that? So just talk for a couple minutes on that, on those three words. You can talk about how they relate to your experience with the podcast, how they relate to your experience outside the podcast. Just what are your thoughts on those three words: debate, dialogue, and discussion? So I'll start the timer here.
Wow. Okay. Open-ended. So I think that debate often has some negative connotations to it, but I also think that we can learn a lot from debate. I've learned a lot from watching debates and from being involved in debates. So I think sometimes it's looked at as a negative thing when it doesn't always have to be. In discussion, and I think all three of these things have some sense of a positive connotation. Like we can learn something, and we can grow as a person by debating, by dialogue, and by discussion. And I think the distinctions that you made are valuable, and they're often overlooked. Like you said, we often talk about, we have this debate or this dialogue, and we use all these words interchangeably. I think that sometimes certain ones can be more productive. I think for a debate, obviously, I think that we have experienced all three on our podcast. I think there have been times when both you and I were entrenched in a certain idea, and we believed ours to be true, and we were trying to disprove the other while shoring up our own. I also think that we've had dialogue and discussion where, particularly from personal experience, where I'm not a math guy and you are. So there have been times where you have walked me through something. Now, I may not have always agreed with it at the end, but it has been more a learning experience for me. And so I think that these things can be interchangeable, but I like the fact that there are those distinctions, and I think we can learn from all three.
All right. Another couple of seconds that you can log into your
That's right.
bank account there.
No, I'm still trying to probably catch up from other times.
That's true. Paying off old debts.
That's right. Maybe. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right. So, all right. So I guess it's your turn to spin the wheel for me.
All right. Here we go. Scott, you landed on politics, buddy. Politics.
All right, my favorite.
Yeah, right. Speaking of debates, right now, we do have some listeners all over the world, I can say now, and so here in the United States, we have the Democratic primaries for president, and we're seeing all kinds of in-house fighting, which is typical. That this happens to Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. This happens. But I was curious as to your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the primary? Who do you see as a front runner? Who do you think will win it? And who do you want to win it? Maybe are two different ones, or two different people. And so I would just like to get your take on the Democratic primaries. And let's start the timer.
All right. So, well, I mean, it's primary season that happens every election, and yeah, there's been some squabbling, but like you said, that's bound to happen. I think that's part of human nature. It seemed like when these candidates and we started out with a dozen or so, or maybe more, the candidate, I mean, it seemed fairly civil at first, but it was bound to be more of a knockdown kind of thing. They've started criticizing each other a little bit more. If you remember back when we talked about how our human beings respond more to negative, negative reinforcement, to negative things. We respond more quickly and more strongly to the idea of losing something or having something taken away, or having something bad happen, as opposed to trying to get something good. And that doesn't mean that we always have to succumb to that, but so we do see some of the candidates kind of squabbling with each other, and it's not surprising. I wish it wouldn't happen. I would prefer that we focus on the positive differences between the candidates, and obviously, because if they knock down a candidate and that candidate ends up winning the primary, then that they've taken something away from that candidate, and so it makes it hard for them to then turn around and support, which they do sometimes, and sometimes they don't. Although all the candidates have agreed that they were gonna, once the primary was over, then they were going to all kind of join together and support whoever the candidate was. At this stage in the game, I know Bernie Sanders is leading, which is fine with me, and I'm going to go over time a little bit here.
Take up my time.
Okay. I'm a big, I'm an Elizabeth Warren fan. I've always been a fan of hers. I supported Bernie in the last election, mainly because Warren wasn't running. They're similar in some ways. They're very different in other ways. I see Warren as a very primarily she's intelligent, and she focuses on problem solving, and that really shows in the way that she campaigns. I think she really cares about what she's talking about. We actually met Elizabeth Warren at a rally. After it was here in St. Paul. And after the rally, she's been doing this at all her campaign stops. She had a selfie line, right? And so people could line up and take a selfie with her, which is fine. We ended up sitting in line for like 4 or 5 hours, something like that. It took us all day to finally get up there. And she was very patient and meeting everybody. But what really impressed me is that, so my kids were ahead of us in line. And so the kids went up and they're big Warren fans as well. And so they met her and took a couple pictures, and then they walked on. And then my wife and I got up there and we were like, oh yeah, those were just our kids. And so she turns and she calls them both by name.
That's impressive.
Like I said, we had been there for 5 hours and she had met, several thousand people. And not that that's, oh my God, she remembered my kid's name, I'm going to vote for her. But, it just shows that she cares about what she's doing, and it's not just a photo op opportunity for her. But I like Warren. I'll be fine. If I had to pick who is probably going to win right now, Sanders is winning. He's not really showing any signs of waning yet. Although Elizabeth Warren, after the debate a couple of days ago, she's kind of had a little resurgence too. So I think I've gone way over my time here.
Feel the burn, baby. Feel the burn. Actually, that's pretty impressive. Remembering the name. I will give her that. That's I can't even remember my name half the time, let alone
she didn't even know we were going to ask her. Right.
So
it was pretty cool. The kids got a kick out of it too.
Very cool. That is Spin the Wheel. And that about wraps it up for episode number 14. Please send us your ideas, questions, and comments to email at godornotpodcast.com. If you'd like to know a little more about the topics covered in this episode, Scott, what do you recommend?
I recommend a book by a physicist by the name of Victor Stenger, and it's The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning, Why the Universe is Not Designed for Us. And, basically just directly, he brings out a lot of the physics and talks about a lot of the data that we have, the information that we know. And he makes an argument that he actually takes it a step further. Not only does he say that we have no reason to believe that the universe was intentionally fine-tuned for us. He actually works to make the case that there's evidence that it was not fine-tuned. And so that's The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning, Why the Universe is Not Designed for Us by Victor Stenger.
Very good. And my book is A Fortunate Universe by Geraint Lewis and Luke Barnes. Geraint is an atheist and Luke is a Christian. And they're both cosmologists, and they both talk about evidence for fine-tuning and why they believe the universe is finely tuned. But then what's neat is the end of the book, the last couple chapters or so, they kind of diverge then, and Geraint talks about how he thinks the universe is fine-tuned and it doesn't have any kind of metaphysical or spiritual connotations, whereas Luke Barnes, he argues for a more theistic or a god for the fine-tuning of the universe. So we have both cosmologists, an atheist and a Christian, both say the universe is fine-tuned, but both of them obviously give different reasons for the fine-tuning. So that is A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos by Geraint Lewis and Luke Barnes.
It's interesting that I'm not surprised that you mentioned that book, because you had mentioned it to me before as we were doing our preparation for the episode. And in my research, I actually found that Luke Barnes did a review of Victor Stenger's book, the one that I recommended. And then also Stenger did a response, paper to Barnes. So,
I read both of those.
Continues on the continuation there.
Right. I read both of those, and I will say that the Luke Barnes response, I only understood about 10% of that. So they did have a lot of high-end cosmology in there. Nothing that I probably couldn't figure out, but take me a couple read-throughs. So that's about it for us. Thanks for joining us. So we hope you'll be back with us next time when Scott and I will be talking about circular arguments. Until then, this is your dialectic duo reminding you to talk to each other.
See ya.
This has been the God or Not podcast. Send your questions or comments to email at godornotpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the show or grab some God or Not gear, please visit the website at www.godornotpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.